Sergio Perez won the second race of the season, and with that, he closed the gap to Max Verstappen to only 1 point in the top of the championship. Now, while the race was not as much fun and did not have as much action, post-race much has been written about the supposed friction between the two Red Bull drivers. Now, much has been said about how Max Verstappen or his father Jos Verstappen were not particularly happy with Sergio Perez winning and Max Verstappen coming in second. There was initially even a fake news floating around that Jos Verstappen did not even congratulate Sergio Perez when he was in the Parc Fermé standing next to him. Now that particular theory has been dispelled, as multiple videos have been shared where Jos Verstappen actually reaches out and congratulates Sergio Perez. Having said that, just to add fuel to the fire, Sergio Perez did something weird as he deleted a tweet where he had mentioned that he wanted to be a champion. Now, when you do something like that, especially when you delete a tweet and then retweet it again, specifically with that particular phrase, "I want to be champion" missing, it does raise suspicions. And it has only led to further speculation, with even Sky F1 pundit David Croft suggesting that all was not well at Red Bull, and he even felt that Christian Horner will have his hands full in trying to manage Sergio Perez and Max Verstappen. Now in this video, the main idea is to ultimately debunk the idea whether the Max Verstappen versus Sergio Perez rivalry, is it even a real thing, or is it a result of the imagination of an overeager bunch of F1 journalists that are trying to generate news in a season where we might be heading for a Red Bull domination. Now to do that, I think it is there for all to see that there have been parallels drawn between the Nico Rosberg-Lewis Hamilton partnership and rivalry at Mercedes from 2014 to 2016, and that has been used as an example or a precedent that could ultimately play out at Red Bull this season. Now to see whether we are heading towards a Sergio Perez versus Max Verstappen conflict, I think it's safe to say that if we analyze the factors that led to the rivalry and conflict between Rosberg and Hamilton, and we try to extrapolate the same to Perez and Verstappen, then we might be able to find out whether we are heading towards a conflict or not. Now just to reiterate, what we are going to do in this video is, we'll take a look at the factors that led to the rivalry between Rosberg and Hamilton, and then ultimately what we'll do is we'll try to extrapolate and see if those particular factors hold true with Verstappen and Perez. If they do, then it means we are heading towards a conflict between Perez and Verstappen. If they don't, then, well, as I said earlier, it's basically a figment of imagination of some overeager journalists. So without further ado, let's analyze what happened between Hamilton and Rosberg, and if the same could happen between Perez and Verstappen. Now the very first factor that played a major role was the fact that Mercedes was a dominant car. Now one of the biggest issues of having a dominant car is the fact that the two drivers in that particular car become rivals. Why? Because there's no one else they need to compete with. In 2014, 15 and 16, Lewis Hamilton and Rosberg did not have any competition. Ferrari had Alonso and Vettel at some time, but the cars were just not quick enough. Red Bull had Vettel and Ricciardo later, and even in that case, the cars were just not capable of fighting for the title. At the end of the day, it was a Rosberg versus Hamilton show, and that is what we saw, as the two drivers found out that the only driver they had to beat was their teammate. Now this point is specifically accentuated if we take a look at the number of 1-2 finishes Mercedes had in 14, 15 and 16. In 14, Mercedes had 11 1-2 finishes out of 19 races. In 15, the number increased to 12 1-2 finishes in 19 races. And in 16, the number was 8 1-2 finishes in 21 races. Now what this means is that more often than not, the two drivers occupy the top spot in every race. When something like this happens, what it tends to mean is that these two drivers are going to be fighting for the title, and there is going to be no one that is going to come in between them. Now in case of Red Bull, at least in the first two races, it does appear that we are heading towards the same trajectory. We've seen 2 races and we've seen 2 1-2 finishes. Sergio Perez has won the race in Jeddah, Max won the race in Bahrain. What this has done is that it has slowly given a realization to both the drivers that the only rival that they will have this season is going to be their teammate. When such a realization happens, it tends to increase friction. And even between these two Red Bull drivers, it could ultimately be a source of friction that the only driver they have to beat is their teammate if they have to win the championship. Now the second factor that plays a role is the reliability affecting the more established driver. Now in 2014 and in 16, This was something that was quite prominent. Now it's safe to say that Rosberg also had his fair share of reliability issues, but most of them went to Lewis. And when something like this happens, the gap automatically increases. If Lewis suffers a DNF in one race, what it means is that he already faces a 25-point deficit. And that meant he had to be very consistent and basically make no mistakes for the next 2-3 races to cut down the gap that has been built by Rosberg. Even in 2023, when we talk about Red Bull, the second race of the season could ideally have been won by Max Verstappen if he did not face the reliability issues in qualifying. Because looking at the weekend trajectory, Verstappen was miles ahead of Perez and he would have easily qualified on pole. Now in the race, even though both had similar pace, it's safe to say that if Verstappen held the lead, he was not going to give it up. That is where an issue could actually arise between the two drivers. Just imagine if in the next race in Australia, Verstappen suffers a DNF and Sergio Perez wins. Now Sergio Perez is looking at a 24-point lead in the championship over Verstappen. That is where tensions could arise between the two drivers. And if something like this happens, we are looking at increased tensions between the two drivers and ultimately relationship turning sour as well. Now arguably the last and the most important point, the fact that the rivalry existed only and only because Nico Rosberg was very competitive against Lewis Hamilton even before they got their hands on a dominant machinery. The two drivers were teammates in 2013 as well, and in 2013 there was hardly anything to choose between the two. Lewis scored 189 points that season, while Rosberg scored 171. Lewis scored one race win that season, Rosberg scored 2. Lewis outqualified Rosberg 11-9, while Rosberg outraced Lewis 8-7. And that is how the first season panned out between the two drivers. Now when you see something like this, what becomes evident is that the team could not anoint any of the two drivers as a team leader. The two drivers were unable to stamp their authority over the teammate. When it was Rosberg's day, Lewis Hamilton could not beat him. And when it was Hamilton's day, he was untouchable and Rosberg could never get close to him. And that is how the rivalry panned out. The two drivers, each of them had their days, and the one that was arguably better at the end of the day was winning. Now when we come to the Red Bull pair in this scenario, this is where the major difference lies in the pairing of Rosberg and Hamilton and Perez and Verstappen. In the last 2 years, Perez and Verstappen have been teammates. There have been only 5 occasions when Perez has finished ahead of Verstappen. Now let's take a look at these 5 races. The first was in Baku 2021. In that particular race, Verstappen suffered from a late race puncture. The second race where Perez finished ahead of Verstappen was in Italy 2021. Even in that race, Verstappen suffered a DNF. Now coming to the 2022 Formula 1 season. In Monaco last season, Perez won the race while Verstappen was P3. In that particular race, I think it's safe to say that Perez held his own and was clearly the better driver. After Monaco, we had Perez finishing ahead of Verstappen at the British Grand Prix. Another race where Verstappen was hampered by a reliability issue as his car got damaged. Then finally, Perez won the Singapore Grand Prix while Verstappen finished much lower in the order. Another race where Verstappen arguably would have won if it was not for the mess created by the team in qualifying. And this is where the difference lies between the two partnerships. While the Rosberg-Hamilton partnership was always close, there was always competition. You cannot say the same thing about the Perez-Verstappen partnership. Verstappen has been the dominant driver at Red Bull, and there has been no two ways about it. And when you look at statistics like 5 times finishing ahead of your teammate in 2 seasons, you don't expect that particular driver to be a championship challenger. I mean, we have to be realistic about it. On pace, Sergio Perez has not been a competitor to Verstappen at any point in the last 2 seasons. And even this season, in the first 2 races, Verstappen would have been the winner if it was not for the reliability issues. So, if we are expecting a championship battle, it is only going to come up if Verstappen suffers a string of reliability issues. If that does not happen, there is no championship battle. And that is what it comes down to. Ultimately, if you're looking for a rivalry or a competition or a rift or tension or whatever we want to call it between the two drivers, there has to be some sort of equity in terms of performance. It does not exist. Verstappen is dominant against Perez, and when that happens, there is no rivalry. So, at the end of it all, if you want my view, it's all a bit of wishful thinking and it's not going to amount to anything. If we are depending on a championship battle between Sergio Perez and Max Verstappen, it's going to come down to loads and loads of fortune for Perez to ultimately stick around in that battle. And I still don't think he can beat Verstappen even in that scenario. So yeah, that's my view. At the end of the day, if I have to give my verdict on Max Verstappen versus Sergio Perez, well, my verdict is that it's all a figment of imagination. There's no reality to it. Sure, he might have aspirations. Sure, he might even want to win. Of course, he would. But he's not doing it. He hasn't done it in the last 2 seasons. He hasn't appeared to do the same even this season as well in the first 2 races. So, yeah, that's where we stand. At least in my view, I don't see a battle. These were my views. What do you guys think? Do like the video, share it with your friends, drop your comments. Thanks for watching and see you next time.